Welcome back and welcome to France 24's debate. Tonight, the fight is on for Ramadi, a campaign to recapture the capital of Anbar province that has now been taken in hand by Shiite militia. That's what their spokesman announced today. And even as the Labaika Ya Hussein operation unfolds, Washington, Baghdad and Tehran are involved in a war of words over who was responsible for the fall of the town in the first place. It was captured, of course, by Islamic State militants on May 17th, the biggest victory for the Islamic State Group in Iraq since the fall of Mosul last year.
Northeast of Ramadi, a massive counter-offensive is set in motion. The Iraqi army, along with Iranian-backed Shiite paramilitaries, are moving south in their bid to drive out the Islamic State Group. The end game, to retake Ramadi.
Operation Labek Ya Hussein will cover the northern areas of Salahuddin province and southwest Tikrit, all the way to northeast Ramadi. This is a vast area, thousands of square kilometers wide, and it's where the Islamic State Group is currently present.
According to Hashad al-Sha'bi, an umbrella group for fighting Shiite militias, the operation has been named after Hassan, one of the most revered imams in Shiite Islam, stoking fears that using Shiite militias may fuel sectarian tensions. Meanwhile, the government is still smarting from comments by the US Defense Secretary that its army, despite vastly outnumbering the Islamic State Group, has no will to fight, sparking a war of words. On the defensive, the chief of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, General Qasem Soleimani, said it's the US that has shown no will to fight, according to Iranian media. Going into damage control, US Vice President Joe Biden reassured Iraq of its commitment in the battle against the Islamic State Group. For its part, Iraq says you only have to look at its track record to see that it's up to the task.
Baghdad is now secure inside Baghdad. We have pushed them, if you remember, a few months ago. I think Baghdad or the airport of Baghdad was threatened. Now we have pushed this back.
As Islamic State Group militants continue to pour more fighters into Ramadi, all eyes will be on the Iraqi army as it puts its training to the test in days to come.
Well, for more on that battle for Ramadi, but also on the war of words between Washington, Baghdad and Tehran, I'm joined for tonight's debate by Julien Théron, who's a political scientist and advisor. Thank you for being with us, as well by William Jordan, another of our regular guests, former American State Department official, by Alain Cavall, who's a freelance journalist specialized in Iraq and Kurdistan. Thank you. Also, we're joined by satellite from Cairo by Zaid al-Ali, who's a senior advisor on constitution building and author of The Struggle for Iraq's Future. Thank you, sir, for being with us. I'd like to ask you, first of all, Julien Théron, what we should make of this announcement by the Shiite militia today that they were taking charge of the campaign for Ramadi and indeed giving it such a controversial name.
Yeah, in a normal state, actually, normally the army is in charge of the control of the territory. Regarding to the complete disparate state of Iraq, some militias took the lead against the Islamic State. So it's the Peshmergas, the Kurdish soldiers up the north, and the Shia militias, which are armed by and trained by the Revolutionary Guards, as we have seen from Iran, in Iraq. So it questions the role of the mainly Shia Iraqi army as well, but they are really a kind of armed arm for Iran, actually. So
I'd like to ask Zaid al-Ali the same question on the name chosen for the campaign by the Shiite militia, the reference, of course, to Hussein. The choice could not have been more controversial, and the spectre of sectarian discord has never loomed greater in that particular part of Iraq.
Yeah, I'm not sure I really agree. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. But Hussein is the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. He's revered by all Muslims. I mean, there's no real controversy about Hussein as an important figure for all Muslims. And in Iraq, I know that other countries and other areas have different perspectives about the Sunni-Shia split. But in Iraq, Sunnis really, they consider Hussein to be part of their own traditions and their own cultures as well. And of course, there's different emphasis. But I'm not really sure that this is such a controversial name. And in any event, the name of the operation is far less important than the actions on the ground. I'm not sure people really care what the operation is called, so long as the operation is successful and so long as it takes place in in a relatively competent and effective manner, which is really what the issue is here, because that's unlikely to happen.
We'll come back to that point you've just made in just a second. William Jordan, I'd like to put that to you. You have no fears of sectarian concerns on the part of the Sunnis of Anbar province as the Shiite militia take control of the campaign to liberate it?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. I have no fears about the sectarian aspects of this. No, I think the sectarian aspects are still very much in the forefront, mostly because of the whole question about the integrity or the, what the Iraqi government and any of the forces that are moving, to free Ramadi actually represent. I mean, right now, nothing has fundamentally changed the problem in Anbar or in any of the Sunni-dominated areas of Iraq. That what is basically happening is you have a Shia-dominated military backed by, or in fact, in this case, overtaken by Shia militias, waging the battle supposedly to liberate them. And given concerns about what happened in the wake of the liberation of Tikrit, and given concerns about the Iraqi military and the government writ large, I still think that there are sectarian issues, even if, as was just stated, I don't think the name is necessarily going to be a particular point of division or controversy.
Alain Caval, I'd like to ask you your idea of the prospects. You mentioned, of course, Tikrit a moment ago, William Jordan. We'd seen with relative success, even though it took longer than they'd said it would, the ability of the Iraqi government held by the Shiite militia to take back Tikrit. Do you expect that this campaign will go as smoothly as that did?
I'm not sure about that. The situation is quite different. We have to remember that the Anbar governorate has been the hotbed and the cradle of the Sunni insurgency in Iraq for almost a decade. So what we have there is a territory which was under, I'm not speaking of Ramadi, but some parts of Anbar, which was controlled by the Islamic State as soon as December 2013 for Fallujah. So taking back the whole of Anbar doesn't seem quite realistic, especially with given the fact that the forces involved are deeply identified as confessional.
I'd like also to put that to Zaid Al-Ali. We have a tweet here from a viewer I'd like to put to you. Iraq claims it can take back Ramadi from ISIS within days. Of course, that's what the Iraqi Prime Minister said in an interview yesterday. We're going to be hearing from him in just a moment. Good luck, says the tweet. All I'm saying is Tikrit captured June 2014, liberated April 2015. Do you agree, Zaid Al-Ali, that this is unlikely to be over within a matter of days?
Well, I don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but the situation in Ramadi today is very different to what it was in Tikrit back in June last year. I mean, in June last year, the security services, Iraq security services, were basically in a state of collapse. Today, obviously, they're still not much better, but there are mobilization forces, and there's much more momentum against ISIS, mobilization against ISIS, than there was back in June. So there's no question that now the rapport de force between the two sides is much more equal than it was back in June. But just to go back to the point, the way in which you described the operation in Tikrit earlier, your question to the previous speaker was whether or not the operation in Ramadi is likely to be as smooth as the one in Tikrit. The operation in Tikrit was not smooth. I mean, there was an overwhelming majority of forces on the side of the pro-Baghdad forces against a much smaller force in ISIS, and it took them 4 weeks to overcome them. And they were only able to overcome them, not as your question implied, just by fighting with the Iraqi military and Shia militias, but after the United States intervened. On this occasion, it's not likely to be much better, because the forces that Baghdad are still organizing, or the pro-Baghdad forces and the militias, they're still in a state of significant disarray, and they're somewhat incapable of organizing themselves effectively, and that's likely to play a factor. It's definitely going to play a factor in the fight in Ramadi.
On that question, William Jordan, of the American-led coalition's campaign in the region, of course, Tikrit was different because it had held back in the beginning of the campaign to retake the city. This time, it is continuing its campaign in the province of Anbar. Is that likely to play a significant role, to make a significant difference, do you believe?
Again, it's impossible to say without having more information on just how the forces are arrayed on the ground. I mean, what people have been saying all along as far as Ramadi is concerned, it's kind of the same thing as happened with Tikrit. I mean, with the Islamic State having had a chance to seize Ramadi and now holding it, establish defensive positions and sort of make things difficult for anybody coming back in, I mean, you're probably facing a sort of house-to-house fighting situation. It's all going to fundamentally come down to a question of how much information. I mean, if you're talking, for example, about air support and that kind of thing, and I know we're going to be probably talking a bit more about this down the road in this discussion, but that begs all of the questions about the quality of the information that you have. There was the article in today's New York Times about how, this reluctance by the Americans to get into a denser and more robust air campaign in order to avoid having civilian casualties as a consequence. That comes into play in this. I mean, until you really know what you're dealing with, how the forces are arrayed, and once you make contact and see how the Islamic State is going to respond. I mean, is the Islamic State going to do as it did in Tikrit and fight tooth and nail to hold on, or is it going to beat some kind of a tactical retreat? We just don't know.
In the meantime, of course, your point alludes to one of the central themes, of course, of tonight's debate, which is how these unlikely bedfellows, which are Washington, Baghdad, and Tehran, in the event, can manage to take on this fight, each from their own point of view, but against a common enemy. Let's have a look, first of all, about what Washington had to say about the reason, from its point of view, that Ramadi had fallen to begin with. It was the American Defense Secretary, Ashton Carter, saying what apparently happened was that the Iraqi forces just showed no will to fight. They were not outnumbered. In fact, they vastly outnumbered the opposing force, and yet they failed to fight. Was it, Julien Tehran, as the Americans suggest, a failure on the part of the Iraqi military due to low morale and an unwillingness to fight?
Well, low morale when you face ISIS, I think that is pretty understandable. Well, the US is pretty angry, actually, because it trained the Iraqi army, it gave a lot of military supplies, and we have seen already earlier, before the fall of Ramadi, that those supplies actually fall in the hands of ISIS. So actually the US are pretty angry against that. But the other point is that they backed the Prime Minister, Haidar al-Abadi, against the choice of Iran, which was more on Nouri al-Maliki. So it's also a political question. It's not only about military strategy.
I'd like you to put it also now to Dr. Abbas Kadim, who joins us now from Washington, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kadim, for being with us. We were talking a moment ago about the war of words between Washington and Baghdad. Of course, the Iraqi Prime Minister has reacted quite angrily, as you just mentioned, Julien Tehran, to that suggestion that the problem on the part of the Iraqi military was one of a lack of will. The Americans, he suggested, must be misinformed. There's a fair amount of tension, is there not, between Washington and Baghdad?
There is a lot of tension, but if I were counseling the Prime Minister Abadi, I should say that he needs to be happy with this assessment from the Pentagon, wrong as it is, because the alternative and more accurate assessment is that the problem of the Iraqi military is lack of leadership. And that is the problem. There is no planning to speak of. There is no good support from Baghdad to the military. And quite frankly, there is no sound and accurate planning for the priorities and the way a military should fight a battle like this. And that is the assessment. The United States, of course, is part of this entire fiasco that we see in Ramadi and we saw in Mosul before. They were the ones who trained the military, as you mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier. They are the ones who are still having an obligation through mutual defense treaties or security treaties. And the support from the United States is not where it should be, at least in the air campaign. 20 campaigns or 20 raids a day. That is not what a battle like this with an area and geography like that would require. So both sides, I think Baghdad and Washington, are missing the point here. They are not keeping their eyes on the ball, which is defeating ISIS and giving what it takes to defeat ISIS, but instead fighting a word war that is among them and leaving ISIS enjoying an easy time. For ISIS to parade all its forces in Ramadi and not have any kind of course of action, it begs the question, in the 1991, when the United States went with all of its force, we did not leave one moving vehicle on the road between Kuwait City and Basra that was moving. So there are many questions about how committed. I'm not talking about conspiracies. I never believe in conspiracy theories, but I'm really looking at the facts on the ground, and I'm looking and explaining the lack of efficiency in combating ISIS and the lack of commitment and the lack of really solid planning, solid coordination between the forces on the ground and the forces in the air, because simply the United States cannot until now come to terms with the idea of dealing with the forces on the ground.
You make a number of points there. I'd like to come back in just a moment, if I may, to the question of the American failings in this respect. First of all, though, Zaid Al-Ali, I'd like to put to you what was just said about the failure of leadership on the part of Baghdad. This is not a failure of the Iraqi military. It is a failure of the Iraqi government.
Well, I'd like to second everything that Abbas just said. I mean, there's clearly a major problem in Baghdad in terms of the support or lack thereof that it offers or doesn't offer to the Iraqi military. But on the point of the United States and its and the comments that the Defense Secretary made, I mean, what they're also lacking, in addition to what Abbas said, is any form of self-reflection over its role and the legacy that it left in Iraq. The United States midwifed the security forces in Iraq. I mean, they're responsible, and they knew exactly what was going on. The lack of leadership, the lack of coordination, the lack of support, the lack of logistical support in the Iraqi military isn't new. It's been going on for years, for many years before ISIS's push into Mosul, and the United States was very well aware of all these things. And they were very well aware also of the amount and the state of corruption in Iraq. I mean, Iraq has been ranked close to bottom of all the international indices on corruption, and that's been very, very well known. And there were officials in the United States Embassy who, as far back as 2006 and 2007, were ringing huge warning signs and warning bells about how corrupt the Iraqi state was. And the United States, kept very, very quiet about that. There was no convincing policy to provide any sort of convincing assistance to the Iraqi state, or even call out Iraqi politicians or the Iraqi state. Instead, they were slapping or welcoming senior Iraqi officials into the Oval Office, congratulating them over how competent and how great the performance was. And now today, what we're hearing from the Secretary of Defense is that Iraqis lack the will to fight. What I would like to see is how much of a will he would have to fight if he was put in the situation that a lot of these Iraqi soldiers were put in, this impossible situation where they were face to face with this gruesome force with extremely little assistance from the United States and extremely little assistance from Baghdad.
We're going to take a break and pick up from those points in just a moment. We'll be right back with the second part of tonight's France 24 debate.